Well, it's one thing for the nation to proclaim David as their king and to be united in the worship of God. If God is going to achieve his purpose, then he has to establish his king over a much wider realm. And this is God's ultimate purpose, that not only will Jesus be King of Israel, but he will be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And this is foreshadowed in David. So in chapter 12 of 1 Chronicles, all the tribes of Israel proclaim David as king. And in chapter 13, David brings the Ark of the Covenant to him in Jerusalem, that the nation might be established under God. And in chapter 14, we find that the influence of David is spread north to Tyre and Sidon, and south to overcome the long-term enemies, the Philistines. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees with masons and carpenters to build him a house. So David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, for his kingdom was highly exalted, for the sake of his people Israel. Then David took more wives in Jerusalem, and David begot more sons and daughters, and these are the names of his children whom he had in Jerusalem: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Elpelet, Nogar, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Beeladah, and Eliphalet. Now when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over all Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. And David heard of it and went out against them. Then the Philistines went and made a raid on the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of God, saying, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand?" The Lord said to him, "Go up, for I will deliver them into your hand." So he went up to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. Then David said, "God has broken through my enemies by my hand like a breakthrough of water." Therefore they called the name of the place Baal Perazim. And when they had left their gods there, David gave a commandment, and they were burned with fire. Then the Philistines once again made a raid on the valley. Therefore David inquired again of God, and God said to him, "You shall not go up after them. Circle around them, and come upon them in front of the mulberry trees. And it shall be, when you hear a sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, then you shall go out to battle. For God has gone out before you to strike the camp of the Philistines." So David did as God commanded him, and they drove back the army of the Philistines from Gibeon as far as Gezer. Then the fame of David went out into all lands, and the Lord brought the fear of him upon all nations. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share these verses from 1 Chronicles 14. The cities of Tyre and Sidon are linked together, they're close together, ancient Phoenician cities and major trading centres, and we have them frequently mentioned in the scriptures from the time of David on in particular. The king of Tyre doesn't see David as a threat, but rather sees in David a sensible and good king who should be encouraged, for he recognises that trade brings well-being to people, and trade needs peace. If you don't have peace with your neighbours, then you cannot build one another up. So often we think we must fight against people to promote ourselves. That's the whole premise of evolution, the survival of the fittest. Fight and establish yourself. But the reality is that we achieve much more for ourselves by cooperating with others than by fighting with them. And so Hiram, king of Tyre, sends help to David as he rebuilds Jerusalem, that he should have a castle, a palace, fitting for a great king. And when David sees that he is being honoured by foreign kings, he acknowledges his God, that God has established him as king. He is here because he has walked with God, and God has exalted him for the sake of his people Israel. In other words, it's not all about David, but God is blessing the people of Israel through David. And as the people are united behind him, so they will become strong and will become a blessing themselves to the nations. Another sign of the progress of David is that he takes more wives and has many sons. And this is an ancient sign of greatness. But when we come to the New Testament, we go back to the original plan of creation, where a man shall have one wife, if he is to be a leader of God's people. But the attitude of Hiram, king of Tyre, is contrasted with the Philistines. They had harassed the Israelites for over 100 years, since the time, at least, of Samson. They were responsible for the death of King Saul. Saul had been fighting them for 40 years and had not been able to overcome them. And now they had killed Saul, and the Israelites had proclaimed a new king. Well, they weren't going to let this new king get away with that. And so they went in search of David. They sent out teams to see whether they could assassinate him to destroy God's work. But David heard of it and resisted them. So the Philistines became more direct, and they raided Israelite territory. David didn't just go and fight them. He asked the Lord, "Shall I go up against the Philistines?" David had learned that you need not just to rely on your own understanding, but to seek wisdom from God. "If I go up, will you deliver them into my hand?" He'd been doing this for a long time. When he delivered Keilah, he asked the Lord, "Shall I go?" And the Lord had said yes. When he defeated the Amalekites after the burning of Ziklag, he'd asked the Lord, "Shall I go?" And the Lord had said yes. So he is in the habit of asking God for guidance. And the Lord says, "Go, I will deliver them." David doesn't rely on his past experience, having defeated Goliath. He is trusting in his God. And God gives him the victory in that battle. But the Philistines come back another day. Again, David inquires of the Lord. He doesn't just assume that he should go and attack them. And this time the Lord says, "Don't go the way that you were thinking of going. Go around behind them, circle around, come at them from the other direction, and wait until you hear the sound of marching in the mulberry trees." So God had a plan and a scheme. It wasn't to David to say, "What has the sound of marching in the mulberry trees got to do with defeating the Philistines?" It was simply a sign that if he attacked at that time, then the Philistines would be caught off guard. And they were. David did as he was commanded, and he drove the Philistines back from Gibeon as far as Gezer. And so they were put back in the box, as it were, and David was well established. But in doing this, the Philistines left their gods behind, their items of gold and silver and ceramic, stone and wood. And David commanded that these things should be burned with fire. They were not to make themselves rich by taking possessions from their enemies that attack them, for that sends the wrong message, that represents the wrong message. If they are fighting for righteousness' sake, then they need to have nothing to do with the false gods of unrighteousness. And so they burned with fire the gods that the Philistines left behind. The reality is that God blesses his people when they walk with him, seeking guidance, praying to him, and doing things his way, even when they don't make sense to us. For victory isn't in our own hands. It is always in the hands of the Lord.